Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist and now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You're free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. And I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you would like. Today marks week 15. I want to thank everybody for hanging out this long that you have. At last count, I have 20 subscribers. I dropped down to 18 for a little bit. I was up to 20, dropped down to 18, but apparently I picked up a couple of more. And I appreciate that. For those of you that have recently subscribed, welcome aboard. For those of you that have been hanging around for a while, thanks a lot. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me. I haven't had a lot of comments this week. I mean, I had some comments on my last Friday video that I want to deal with today. But as you can probably tell from the title, I was asked a very interesting question a couple of days ago when I was at work because somebody asked me about my faith and my beliefs. And when I kind of told them, I was an atheist and it's more specifically probably a pagan atheist. That's my little joke. But from my perspective, I've never really had problems with pagans. They don't try to lop off my head in the name of their faith. People of the monotheistic religions will do that, but not too many pagans that I know of. But the question came, what was it like to be a pastor? And so I am going to address that question. I do want to get to another comment first. Max Doubt wrote me last week saying, and he gave a really brilliant comment. I'm not going to deal with the whole comment. The only part of the comment that I thought the comment was pretty brilliant and well done. But, I'm a skeptic, but I'm taking too far. Once something, convinces me, I go for it. I would agree with that. I probably should clarify. The reason I am a skeptic for the most part, if something passes muster in the sense that I've attacked it from every which way I can, but I don't see any more flaws or any way to attack it, it just means it's at the end of my limited commitment. I'm going to hold to it and not necessarily defend it all the time if it's something new, but if it's something that's proven true to me over and over again, yeah. You're going to see it. Probably a good case is one that I did bring up last time, which is climate change. I think the real problem with the climate change argument is the extremists on both sides, which is kind of the road I've taken, that I've taken, which is I do believe global warming, for instance, is happening. I do believe that's causing other climate changes, including other cold spells. I mean, climate's kind of like that. You warm up one part of the planet and another part seems to get colder. And, things like that. I'm no meteorologist or expert, but, there's high and low pressures and all that stuff that a meteorologist would know more about than me. But at the same time, as I recognize the data only shows a slight curve. It doesn't show this radical jump. And we're talking about something that we've only been able to keep track of over the last couple hundred years, which is significantly short enough time that a 2-degree jump in that time span is significant. But it's not we're going to go up 6 degrees in the next 10 years kind of evidence. There's no evidence for that. I think the problem is, and maybe I recognize the dangers of extremists having been a religious person, extremism causes you to do things that you normally wouldn't do to other human beings. But because you believe something so strongly, you're willing literally to set aside your humanity to be inhumane in the name of your cause. And that's my usual problem with most extremism. And you'll see extremism on the right and left when it comes to climate change. And probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's somewhere, we are experiencing global warming. There is some climate change ahead. It's going to have some problems with it. The question is, will humanity adapt to it? I am also of the opinion that it's a little bit inevitable at this point. I think the warm up from the ice age makes it inevitable. I think it's us, doing our thing as human beings that may be accelerating things. And part of that may simply not be, pollution. It just may be more and more people keep getting born and living. We're just getting really good at surviving. And that has its downsides, including maybe changing the climate of our planet a little bit. Because we are a part of the planet. I don't separate humanity over here and nature over here. That's a very theological concept. It's a spiritual concept. If evolution is true, then we are as much, when a human being makes a dam, that's no different than what a beaver does. When we build homes, it's no different than a bird making a nest. We just do it in, I suppose one might say, a more sophisticated manner, but I would challenge any human being to make a nest like a bird does and do it right. Good luck. It's really probably a lot more complex than most human beings can handle. So we do have that. But my skepticism extends to the point where if I get to a point where it is, kind of like, one of the things I used to use as an analogy is I treat every idea like Parliament treats a bill, English Parliament. If you're familiar with English Parliament, you know that their debates can be quite robust, and they literally treat it like a rag doll coated with meat juice thrown to pit bulls. If any part of the rag doll survives, then it was worth it. And I think that's kind of how I treat ideas. I'm going to attack them, not because I'm looking to destroy all ideas. I'm just looking for something that has some value. And when I do find something with value, then I kind of cling to it and apply it to the various aspects of my life. All right, getting to the main question of the day, what was it like to be a pastor? To set the context of this, I'm always wearing my medallions. And I was wearing a new one yesterday, which had a Viking helmet, a couple Viking axes, and, a rune circle. And one of my coworkers noticed it and said, and we started talking about Viking runes, and it kind of led to a discussion, what we believe. Now, I've had a close thing, and I don't get offended by talking about religion or beliefs, but I'm kind of cautious because other people do. And I'm not trying, at work, I'm there to work, not necessarily have a theological discussion. But, it was kindly offered, he said, someday I'm going to have to pick your brain on what it was like to be a pastor and why somebody would leave that to become an atheist. But the question of what it was like to be a pastor now in retrospect, as I look back at it, is kind of a very conflicted question for me. On the one hand, there's a lot of good things to ministry, but they're dangerous as shit when you really look at them. I enjoyed preaching and teaching. In fact, if there's anything that I miss, it's the instructional teaching element of life. I don't really have that now, except here on YouTube when I do these videos. That's probably kind of why I'm gravitating towards YouTube, because it kind of gives me that platform. So there's that aspect of it that I miss. And locally, I was known as a pretty damn good preacher. I'm one of those people that has memorized good chunks of the Bible, so I could pull verses out of anywhere. I couldn't give you chapter and verse references all the time, but I could quote spots exactly. Still can. It's just practice and memorization. And I was a Bible quizzer for years, so I learned how to memorize verses very, very quickly, and I had a pretty good knowledge of it. So I could preach and pull verses from various parts of the Bible that connected with what I was saying. And most of the time, I also could take them in context, which is kind of rare sometimes for most preachers. They just kind of grab shit and run with it. Saw that all the time. But I enjoyed that part of it. I enjoyed organizing ministries and putting them together. I was a Sunday school superintendent, then a Christian education pastor for a while. I enjoyed that job, probably most of all in my ministry, because I got to sit down with my educators. I got to sit down with my assistants, and we would talk about how to minister to kids. Then you also had the aspects of the ministry that I didn't like so much, which is part of it was dealing with very manipulative and controlling people. The real problem with church as I see it, as I mentioned extremism in my first example to max doubt, is this. In church, you have a natural extremism that's there, and people take that different ways. And how does that affect you as a pastor? Well, if they think they're right, No amount of persuasive attempts on your part will change that. Every church I had at least one person in it, if not more, that were very, very stuck on the idea that they knew more or were more spiritually gifted or had a better understanding of life, the universe, and everything than I did. And maybe they did. It doesn't really matter. But when you get to the point of ego, where you think that if the pastor is wrong, then you have the right to challenge him, that can create problems for a pastor. Now, I'm not a big authoritarian leader. Anybody who's been under my leadership knows I am very laissez-faire with a lot of things. I don't spend a lot of time ordering people around. I just don't do that. And in ministry, it's a dangerous thing to do anyway. People don't have to come to your church, and they don't have to fill the pew, and they don't have to drop money in the offering plate. So it's not like you want to really torque people off. With some denominations, it's a little different because they have a very authoritarian stance. And because of that, they can get away with a lot more. But most of my churches had congregational government, which meant that the congregations voted a lot of things. Believers, they believed in the priesthood of all believers. So the only thing I really had as a difference in almost all those churches was my role. And I was hired basically to preach, to teach, to guide the ministries, which I enjoyed doing. The problem was a lot of people have all these other expectations of what they expect out of a pastor. And many of those expectations I would at times didn't consider biblical. I also didn't consider them realistic. I remember one of the jokes that I used to have is when I was in the ministry in my last church, my wife had a coworker ask me to pray over a certain situation in their life. And it gets kind of comical because one of the things this person said was, well, I want your husband to pray because he's a pastor. That means he has a better connection with God. Do I now? Looking back at it as a skeptic, it's probably a common conception that men of God are somehow special. Looking at it now, I can't figure out how people think that. A pastor is just a guy who has picked a certain occupation. He's decided to do a certain thing. I would now say that occupation in large part involves telling stories that have either a moral lesson or something and building up hope that is in people that certain things are true. I now believe that most of those things I was trying to build up people to hope are false. So it's not like that I look back at it and that's kind of an embarrassing thing. There's also some of the guilt that's associated with this a little bit when you ask what it's like to be a pastor. In my first couple of churches, because I was much more fundamentalist, I would open up I would run into women that I could tell they wouldn't openly say they were abused by their husbands, but their husbands were good Christian men. Some of them were even deacons in my church. And I would find that they had all the signs of abuse. And as a good Christian pastor who was fundamentalist, who believed in the Bible very strongly, I would open up the book to 1 Corinthians, and I think it's 7 or whatever, and I would counsel them, well, as long as they want to be with you, you don't have the option of divorce. In fact, the Bible is very confusing on divorce because the Old Testament allows men to divorce their wives, but not wives to divorce their husbands. And Jesus doesn't really confront that issue. He doesn't confront the sexism issue, but he basically says if you divorce and get married to another, you're committing adultery, which means that anybody who gets divorced is committing adultery. And then Paul complicates the matter further in 1 Corinthians 7, where he says a believer, if an unbeliever divorces a believer, there's no obligation there and they're free to remarry and so on and so forth. So what you have is the Bible being very confusing and conflictory, giving advice that seems contradictory. But I would take them to that passage and say, yeah, it says you're supposed to stay with him, okay? That by your, chaste, humble manner, you can win your husband to Christ. And the most important thing is that he gets one to Christ because Jesus loves him too. And I'm giving this as one example of many that I now look back at and, oh my God, I probably caused a person to stay in an abusive environment that now I would tell them, yeah, they don't love you. They don't care about you. Fuck them, get out. That's what I tell people now. Whenever I hear about people being abused, I say, out, done. You need to leave. Okay. If they don't love you enough not to abuse you, then they don't love you. Okay. They just don't. I just don't have any tolerance for that anymore. Telling, parents that spanking their kids is okay when it's a debatable point. Telling women that they needed to be forced to keep their child, even though that child may have been product of a bad relationship, and now they're pregnant, and the guy has left them, and it's like this child is going to grow up in a single parent home. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it does make it harder. And in a society that values two parents, we can debate that all day long, but our society seems to have this residual belief that two parents are better than one. And there are some advantages to two parents, but if we take that logic to its logical conclusion, why not 3 or 4 or 5? Maybe the polyamorous culture has a better idea and understanding of this. But the problem with being a pastor, ultimately, especially if you're a Bible-believing pastor, is you have to constantly figure out how to get this book to apply to life. And the problem is it's at least 2,000 years old in spots. And most of it is written by either goat humpers or people of an ancient mindset, Middle Eastern mindset that doesn't jive well with Western one. Looking back at it, that was my constant struggle, how to get this Bible thing, to be applicable to people's lives, because that's what they were expecting me to do, and show them how to make that happen. And many times it just didn't work. There was just no good way to say it. And I said, these are your options, pray about it and pick one. And that seems pretty lame, but in truth, that's where you're left if you take the Bible seriously. In my last church, I was less of a fundamentalist, but I constantly ran into the problem of really nice people that are manipulative and controlling. And that's the biggest problem I have with religion, is you are trained to accept authority or get into a position of authority and lord over others. And a lot of people that are failures in their careers and unsuccessful in achieving their goals in other walks of life will come to the church and assume that their crap doesn't stink, and it's their real problem in regular life is, they're trusting in God and they're being persecuted because they believe in Jesus or whatever. No, it's because you're incompetent and sometimes you're a jerk. And people don't like to accept that. So you have to watch that on both ends, because I began to realize that a lot of people in the church that were in church leadership were basically failures everywhere else. And that's not to diminish them as human beings. It's just you need to kind of wake up and realize maybe you're doing something wrong. So there's that. One other aspect of being a pastor that I didn't really care for was holding the hands of the dying. And near the end, it got really bad because my last 3 or 4 years I didn't believe. And so I'd do a funeral and I'd be saying, they're in the arms of Jesus, and not believing it for a second. Caused a lot of stress. People ask me why, the blow up, why I had an affair, why all the rest of it. And I'm very transparent about that because I want to help people in that situation. Stress and not being fulfilled, and my faith being realizing that I was living a lie and making my living off of a lie. And when you're an honest person by nature, that drives you nuts. People are often struck about how frank I am sometimes. And that's because I'm normally very honest. I think I probably try to protect myself just like anybody else with my words. And I've gotten more defensive and protective, since a lot of people have turned their backs on me since my departure, but people that I trusted. And so it becomes a more difficult proposition for me to trust people at times. But as I look back at it, that was probably the most difficult thing, is coming to the realization that my career as a minister was depending on a bunch of people that were fairly incompetent. They had demonstrated their incompetence in their real life. I lost track of the number of deacons that had put in for a promotion and not gotten it, and they were bitter about it, or they had broken up with a boss or employer and they blamed the boss and employer for it, when really, after I got to know them, well, you're kind of an egotistical ass. Nobody, you can't have, two alpha wolves, it just doesn't work. And, somebody has to submit, and this idea, people had a, real problem. On the one hand, they would want me to exercise my authority as pastor over other people, but they sure as hell didn't want me to do it to them. That's probably one of the most frustrating things on a personal level. But mostly, I enjoyed certain aspects. I enjoyed helping people get through their problems when it was legit, but I think I did that more at the end of my ministry, when I didn't refer to the Bible as much and started to refer to common sense. The guy's beating the shit out of you. He doesn't love you. You probably should break up with him. Probably get a divorce and get a restraining order so he doesn't beat you up anymore. Go find some place where you can shelter and get some kids, get your kids out of there and go do something. When we ran across a couple of homeless people staying in the park, it was nice they were legitimately homeless, and helping them find a way back to not being homeless was pretty cool. For a long time, my last church fed people. And at first, it really was a needs-based thing, because Michigan was going through a recession at the time and manufacturing was shutting down. And we were helping families, have a good hot meal once a week. I really enjoyed that part of it. But I can do all that without faith or religion. I don't have to be a religious person to do all the helping hand things. That's kind of one of the things I want to get back to normal with this COVID thing. I want to get back to the moment where I can look at somebody on a park bench, see that they're having a hard time, sit down beside them, put my arm around them, say, hey, it's going to be okay. I want to be able to do that again. Right now, people would absolutely yell at you for doing that. This quarantine needs to end, because it's robbing us of our humanity. We're starting to lose our humanity and our personal care for each other, because that requires personal touch. That requires this. And I think it's going to be a problem. And that is something I did learn as a pastor. People respond more to you treating them like a human being than treating them like an object. And that's still true, regardless of faith. But I could go on and on about what it was like to be a pastor. I have 20 years of experience doing it. And it has its highs and lows. But mostly it's some of the people that were... I met some of the worst people that I know in the church. I met some of the best, too, don't get me wrong, but some of the worst, most manipulative, controlling, used religion as a sword to beat other people up, people I met in church. And, they did some of the most despicable things to their loved ones in the name of their faith. And, that's something I don't want to return to ever again. Well, thank you for stopping by and listening to me ramble. Welcome to my channel. Comments have a way of influencing and determining the content of Friday's videos, as you can see. And I respond to comments when I can and the way I can. You can also ask a direct question every time if you're looking to understand something. And you can always suggest things that you'd like to see me do. Videos are uploaded every Tuesday and Friday about 6 o'clock. One thing I don't tolerate is name calling in the comments section, so be advised. You're welcome to demonstrate that people are an idiot. You're just not allowed to call them one. Be sure to like and subscribe and get your notification bell set the way you want it for more content is released. And hopefully I can one day convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd, the Rabid Atheist, signing off and wishing you a good day and be safe.